Let Freedom Ring, King's Dream, and the McCall Family, Spencer McCall, January 2023. In my family, it was a tradition to watch the MLK series starring Paul Winfield. And my father would discuss how his sister, my aunt, Shirley McCall Fennell, was involved in the March on Washington with Dr. King and the civil rights protest in North Carolina. The McCall family's involvement in the movement for freedom, however, began much earlier, nearly 100 years earlier, in March of 1865, when General Sherman and his men entered Cheraw on the 3rd of March. He was met by the mayor of Cheraw and the town wardens who waved white flags in hopes the town would not be burned, as Sherman and his men had just burned the courthouse in Chesterfield. At this time, the enslaved people of the area were in effect free, and many of the black men would fall behind Sherman's troops and join the USCT. Amongst those enslaved people were my third great-grandfather, George McCall, who was born around 1798, who died after 1880. Three of his known children were Elizabeth Betsy McCall, Daniel McCall, and Frank McCall, my second great-grandfather, and you see, in 1880, George living with his sister, Rachel Hooks, and her grandson, Harry Ellaby. George's sons, Daniel and Frank, and his grandson, Nelson, son of his daughter, Elizabeth, would join the USCT. Daniel and Frank served in the newly formed 135th Regiment, which was organized in Goldsboro, North Carolina on March 27, 1865, from newly freed black men who had followed Sherman's troops. And this regiment marched with General William T. Sherman's army in the Grand Review at Washington, D.C. on May 24, 1865, and they passed the president under their own flag. In 1869, Governor Robert Kingston Scott authorized a state militia to be organized with blacks, in which black men could defend themselves from the terrorist attacks of the KKK and similar organizations. White men could also join the militia. Members of the McCall family who were known to have served in the militia were Frank, Daniel, Spencer, Chester, Robert, Primus, Aaron, Kent, Jack, Peter, and Enoch McCall. Other relatives who also served were Hutton Ford Sr., Robert Reed, Patrick Ford, Harry Hutley, Silas Campbell, and Harry Campbell. Dr. Claudius W. McCall, grandson of George McCall, son of Elizabeth, Betsy, and Peter McCall, was a teacher, minister, and professor who organized black newspapers in Cheraw, Bennettsville, and Columbia, South Carolina, and Charlotte, North Carolina in the late 1800s to allow blacks of the Carolinas to have a voice and a means to share news. He, however, wasn't the only McCall to serve as a publisher. His cousin, James Edward McCall, also known as the Race Man and the Blind Poet, would also serve as a publisher. James Edward's ancestors were amongst the enslaved McCalls and descendants of George, who traveled with the white McCalls during slavery to Lowndes County, Alabama. In college, James caught typhoid fever and as a result became blind. He dedicated his life to presenting the issues of inequality through his writings. He wrote articles on the plight of black maids and published articles in black and white newspapers in Montgomery before he published his own newspaper, The Emancipator. Due to threats from the Klan, he and his wife Margaret moved to Detroit, Michigan. where they owned a publishing company and edited the weekly Detroit Independent in the 1920s. And by 1935, he was owner and publisher of the Detroit Tribune. Deacon George McCall was born April 4th, 1913 in Cheraw, South Carolina, to Israel and Mary Davis McCall. George, however, would live most of his life in Farrell, Pennsylvania. His father, Israel, owned a store in Cheraw. And while George was working elsewhere as a teen to make extra money, he got involved in an altercation with a fellow white employee, and he won the fight. The Reverend Samuel Delaney of Sharon, Pennsylvania, was running a week-long revival at PD Church in Cheraw. Fearing for George's life, Reverend Delaney cut the week-long revival short, and George was packed in his car, and they rushed out of Cheraw to Pennsylvania. Reverend Delaney and his wife raised George as their own son in Pennsylvania, and George never returned to Cheraw. Due to this incident, he will be amongst the first of the McCalls to attend an integrated school, and you see him in this picture in Farrell High School in Farrell, Pennsylvania in 1935. Shirley McCall Fennell was involved in the 1960 KNW sit-ins in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and you see pictures here from that protest and sit-in. A daughter of the Reverend George J. McCall and Pearls Bain McCall Kleiner, Shirley, who was about 14 years old, lied about her age and said that she was older so that she could take part in the civil rights movement in Winston-Salem, again, at the age of 14. She was involved with CORE, the SCLC, and other groups where they were trained for the sit-ins. She was arrested for taking part in the sit-ins, and she also took part in King's March on Washington, D.C. Her first cousin, Yvonne Lynn McCall, a model, poet, and teacher, and the daughter of the late Robert Claudius and Mary Wall McCall, was active in the civil rights movement in High Point, North Carolina. And she was also involved with the Black Panther Party and their efforts to serve the poor and needy. In Cheraw, attorney John Evans McCall, who was son of Evans and Amanda Shields McCall, was a teacher, a veteran, and by the 1950s, a prominent attorney, legal advisor to the Cheraw NAACP, and vice president of the Southeastern Lawyers Association. He was on the KKK's Most Wanted Dead list. And once while being on the stage of the politician at the state level, the politician was rebuked for just being on stage with him. In 1967, he served as the pole mark for the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. During the same year, he entered the Cheraw Hospital for a small illness and died there under mysterious and odd circumstances. Before his death, his son, John Chip McCall Jr., would integrate the Cheraw and surrounding schools under his father's guidance. Like his father, however, John Jr., or Chip as we call him, was also listed on the South Carolina Klan's Most Wanted Dead list. Dr. Emmanuel McCall, son of the Deacon George McCall of Farrell, Pennsylvania, having spent his life serving toward racial reconciliation in the Southern Baptist Convention. On the national and international scene, the CBF wrote of him, "The Reverend Dr. Emmanuel McCall is a trailblazer who has spent much of his life working for racial justice as a student leader, pastor, author, and scholar. The purpose of the Dr. Emmanuel McCall Racial Justice and Leadership Initiative is to create avenues for God's imperfect church to move toward meaningful unity between racially diverse communities." His sister, Reverend Myrtle McCall, a 1980 graduate of Yale Divinity School, was recruited while in college to serve as a youth minister to a prominent church who wanted their students be educated in the issues of social justice and the black community. Myrtle remains a leader in this movement in the Presbyterian Church. Robert L. McCall organized one of the first King Day celebrations in the United States. In 1968, following the death of MLK, Robert McCall, a principal musician and radio announcer and son of Deacon George and Amelia Reed McCall, would organize Cheraw's MLK celebration, which was one of the first, if not the first, in the nation. Robert's niece, Emma McCall Curry, a community activist, was relentless in working to have the town of Cheraw to establish a street in honor of MLK. Her work proved successful, and today there is a MLK Drive in Cheraw, South Carolina. Felicia Flemming McCall organized and opened an African American museum in Cheraw to showcase and preserve the legacy of black successes and the black struggle for freedom in the U.S. And today, historians in our family and who serve as writers and presenters and share information and research our history to ensure that the story of our family and its work goes forward. Amongst these are LaTanya Gordon, Joyce Dukes, Ryan Newell, and myself. George Santana wrote or said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And 2 Peter 1:12 records, "Therefore, I will always be ready to remind you of these things, even though you already know them and have been established in the truth, which is present with you." Today's music is provided by Uncle Robert L. McCall and his nationally renowned PD Chorale Ensemble from their works from 1945 to 1960. We will close with a reading from James Edward McCall and entitled "The New Negro." The New Negro. He scans the world with calm and fearless eyes, conscious within of powers long since forgot. At every step, new man-made barriers rise to bar his progress, but he heeds them not. He stands erect, though tempests round him crash, though thunder burst and billows surge and roll, he laughs and forges on, while lightnings flash along the rocky pathway to his goal. Impassive as a sphinx, he stares ahead, foresees new empires rise and old ones falls, while caste-mad nations lust for blood to shed. He sees God's finger, writings on the wall. With soul awakened, wise and strong, he stands, holding his destiny within his hands. James Edward McCall, The New Negro. Be sure to like my video and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and have a very blessed MLK Day.